Right, there we go. I finally found the right button. All right. So I hope your Friday is good, or whenever you're listening to this. It is chapter 15, and we're talking about the age of absolutism. This is a map, and we talked about this earlier in the week, that after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, you've got Paris, and about 500 miles out from Paris, and you will get the center and kind of our new modern leaders of Europe. So definitely the French, the English, and then we'll include the Dutch at least for a while, as they use their joint stock companies and their ports in India to dominate at least until the end of the 17th century. All right, so that's where we are. We talked about absolutism. It's concentration of the rule into the hands of one person, as versus constitutionalism, which developed in England, where the Stuarts had to share their power. So we're going to talk about the successful absolute monarchs, and actually just particularly the French ones in this lecture. But I want to help you set up your thinking about these absolute monarchs by recognizing that there are three common characteristics that all of your absolute monarchs share. First thing is control over the nobility. And so if you look at your great ones, Peter the Great, self-titled the Great, but Peter the Great, Frederick William the Great Elector from Prussia, Peter was from Russia, Frederick the Great Elector from Prussia, and then your most successful absolute monarch, Louis the 14th. The 13th set him up, the 14th was the most successful. Those three guys did these three things very well. So they controlled their nobles, they had a very strong army, well, as strong as the French army could possibly be, and then they all instituted mercantilist policy. And if you remember, mercantilism is all the economy completely run by the government. Bullionism, meaning gold and silver, is what measured wealth. And then that whole idea that your nation wanted to be self-sufficient. You didn't want to have to rely on trade with other countries. And if you did trade, you did it the way that the Japanese trade. You import cheap stuff and you export electronics, although there were no electronics in the 17th century. So long term, when you think about this age and the age of absolutism, 17th century, you're going to want to keep these three things in your mind and then say, okay, how did Peter do these things? How did Louis do these things? How did Frederick William the Great Elector do these things? And that will get you really far, at least long term on an essay. You're going to need some more details than that on Tuesday for me and for Mr. Shaw, but certainly long term, this is the way that you should remember them. All right, the three things that make these absolute monarchs successful. All right, so let's get to Louis. Louis the 13th, as we said, he set him up. He will take over at the age of 9, and so he needs a cardinal. We've talked about Louis a little bit from the 30 Years' War already. He just put it all out here, and you should have already written it down, so you shouldn't be writing it down now. But his cardinal's name was Richelieu, and Richelieu will really run the government during Louis the 13th's reign. He'll never really rule by himself. Richelieu just has too much power. And anyway, he has policy towards the Huguenots, so no military and political power to the Huguenots. 1598 was your Edict of Nantes. That's what gave your Huguenots religious toleration. In France, they'll basically take that away. Richelieu will, even though he will side with the Huguenots and the Protestants during the 30 Years' War, which is during this time. But he, in his own country, is going to limit their right to hold jobs and to have any power. Second thing, he's going to restructure the royal council. Basically, this means he's going to try and limit the power of the nobles of the sword. And if you remember earlier this week, we talked about the sword versus the robe. The sword are your old nobles, which have had the power since forever, and your new nobles are ones that are appointed for money. And so Richelieu will restructure his council to use new nobles so that they're intensely loyal to both Louis XIII and Richelieu. And the last thing, and probably most important thing that he will do, is the system of intendants. The system of intendants will further centralize his power. He will divide it into 32 districts. So he'll divide France into 32 pieces, and he will personally appoint one intendant in charge of each district. And that person is in charge of things like recruiting soldiers for the army, tax collection, economic activities, so regulating mercantilism, although Louis XIII did mercantilism very poorly, and laws and order, justice, all of that. But probably the most important thing that they do is they spy on the local nobles of the sword to make sure that they're not organizing any sort of revolt or doing anything that would go against Richelieu and Louis XIII. So the system of intendants will really be important to Louis XIV in centralizing power, because it's a huge step in France, which is definitely more loyal, or had been more loyal, to the nobles than the king himself. All right, so last thing is huge debt. He is not able to achieve the success that Louis XIV does because he just spends too much money and doesn't have good enough mercantilist policy. Richelieu was a great guy and he was a great leader and he knew what he was doing to centralize power, but his economic policy sucked, and so Louis XIII will not go down as your best ruler. Instead, it will be this guy. And when you are as powerful as Louis XIV, you can wear stupid outfits like this. So he reigned for 72 years. Louis XIV nicknamed himself the Sun King and dressed appropriately. So you've got the sun outfit here, you've got the sun in the center. Each of these, this picture's kind of bad, but each of these little suns on his skirt, he's got sun knee buckles and shoe buckles. His whole head's a sun, if you'll notice, and then obviously his waist is a sun, his neck's a sun, his shoulders a sun, the rays coming off here, and then I don't know where he got this stupid hat. I'm not sure where the suns are in there, but I'm sure they're somewhere we just can't see them. Anyway, so this is the guy that becomes the greatest leader of Europe, probably ever, at least the best leader in France. He also dresses like this and like this. Now, he was one of the first guys to operate under that assumption that if you want to be important, you have to look important. And while we think he looks absolutely ridiculous, this was important in 17th century France. And so the higher his platform shoes and his tights, and I'm not sure why he's hiking up his skirt here, but this whole getup is important. And so he will really be the model, and the palace that he builds and the outfits that he wears, his court will be the model of courts across Europe. So 72 years this guy reigns. He will take the throne at the age of 5. So Louis XIII is going to die. He will take the reign at 5, and Richelieu will handpick Mazarin, Cardinal Mazarin, to be Louis XIV's guy. When Louis is 21, he kicks out Mazarin. He declares his famous words, "I am the state," and he calls himself the Sun King, and he rules by himself. So "I am the state" just really means that France and Louis XIV are synonymous. They cannot be parted. He is France, and France goes how Louis XIV goes. So he didn't have an ego at all. But him, along with Mazarin in the early years, will make France the center of Europe. All right, so early influence. If you didn't get this out of your book, you need to make sure that you get it now. When he is, find me an age. I think he's 5. It's right after he takes power. 1648. So yeah, he's been in power about 5 years, so he's 10 years old. And the nobles revolt. And so this really has very little to do with Louis. It's the nobles of the sword versus the nobles of the robe in Paris. And they're doing a pretty bloody battle because they all have the money to do a pretty bloody battle. So in his backyard, nobles for like 4 years are killing each other. They're banging on the fences of the palace and creating mad chaos in Paris. So this is at 10 years old, and he really vows then and there that he is going to be an absolute ruler, that he is going to limit the power of the nobles, and that this is not going to happen. And so he fears the nobles, and the French people fear the nobles, because they decide, the urban poor of Paris that live through this Fronde, or the noble revolt, decides that they are going to take their chances with the throne, not with the nobles, that they can't trust these bloody, vicious nobles. And the peasants really feel the same way because it's the nobles that are mean to them. So people really have their faith in Louis, but Louis, probably his earliest memory, one of his earliest memories, is fleeing in a carriage from this crazy, bloody revolt in Paris that took place in his backyard. So he wants to be an absolute monarch, and he will want to rule with an iron fist. The other thing that it does is that it will cause him, once he takes power when he's 21, to move the seat of the monarchy, so the monarchy's castle, from the Tuileries Palace, which is in Paris, 12 miles out to Versailles, really thinking that 12 miles is a long way to walk for people who are really angry. And if they want to get ticked off and march 12 miles to get him, that he's willing to take his chances, as opposed to this mob of Paris that is right there in his backyard. So Versailles will really be born out of this idea that he was afraid, and he wanted to move outside the inner city in Paris. All right, so how does he centralize power? As the most successful guy, he restructures the government bureaucracy, again, appointing his own loyal nobles. He will revoke the Edict of Nantes, and this is more of a religious thing. It's not one of those characteristics that's central to the 3 successful absolute monarchs just in France. He'll revoke the religious toleration officially of the Huguenots with the Edict of Fontainebleau, and that is supposed to be one word. But I made it too, so we'll live. Anyway, it's in your book. The Edict of Fontainebleau, or blue, or whatever you want to say, made Catholicism the official religion and didn't allow the Huguenots places to worship. So 1685, France is officially Catholic under Louis XIV. He will have a strict mercantilist policy under this genius, Jean Colbert. Louis can't do half the crap he does without Colbert. So everyone needs a smart guy that helps him out, and Colbert is Louis' smart guy because he spends money like it's going out of style. Last thing that he does, probably the best known thing, and oh my gosh, I only have 4 minutes, I'm running out of time, is he builds Versailles as a show of power. And he brings the nobility there to watch them, because he's afraid of them, and he feels like that whole idea of keeping your enemies closer, your friends close and your enemies closer, he really takes that to heart, and he invites the richest families in Paris to live at his big old palace. And the story of Versailles, and I wish I had more time to tell you, but it's very interesting. It starts 1623. It wasn't nothing. He had a hunting shack. His father had a hunting shack there. Well, I'm sure his father's hunting shack must look different than my father's hunting shack, because my father's hunting shack couldn't be turned into this. There's like mice and really old mattresses. It's not good. Anyway, so this is it was his little hunting shack. He, for the next 40 years, makes embellishments. Obviously pretty sizable embellishments. And in 1682, the Palace of Versailles becomes the official residence. It has 1,300 rooms, big ballrooms. It has a cathedral in it, all sorts of fairly amazing and very detailed works, rooms, architecture. So it's perfectly balanced. If I go back, it's perfectly balanced. Louis, because he is the Sun King, Louis' bedchamber is at the exact center of the Palace of Versailles, because everything in France rises and sets with Louis. So his bedchamber is in the exact middle, and then everything is balanced, the wings and the whole palace balanced on each side. Right, here's what it looks like when you walk up, and this is the back. This is his backyard. This right here is the Hall of Mirrors, famous signing at the treaty to end World War I. The Treaty of Versailles was signed here in 1919. This is basically, if you want to say from the deck, there isn't a deck, but deck looking out at the gardens, hunting land. I mean, it's a huge property because Louis liked to hunt. All of these statistics, interesting. The fountains and the nozzles, they actually had people who would stand at the fountains, and then people would whistle, and they'd turn the water on when the king walked by, so that whenever the king walked by any of these fountains, they were in full water flow. 200,000 trees. I mean, the gardens are beautiful that they plant every year, if you ever get a chance to go. Here they are. Way back from the backyard. Okay, quickly about how it was used to limit the power of the nobles, and then we'll talk about the poor queen. Okay, so to limit the power of the nobles, he invited them to live there, and he gave them jobs. All right, so this is the king's bedchamber, and every morning he had a little ceremony that woke him up. And so you got the job to buckle the king's shoe, and someone else got the job to help him put his tights on, and someone else got the job to help him brush his teeth. I don't know if they brushed their teeth back then, but everyone had a little job. And so he brought them there to do this job, and then the rest of the day they just partied it up at Versailles. So it was a great gig. As much as you think brushing the king's teeth is gross, if all you had to do every morning was get up at 9:30 and brush the king's teeth, you would do it to live at Versailles and party the rest of the day, or hunt, or do whatever it is that they did. So the king brought the nobles there, and then he could watch them, and no one wanted to lose their, the great life that they had there, so no one revolted, and that's how you get to be successful at ruling for 72 years. Alright, the time is going to be up on me, and so remind me on Monday, if you watch this, to ask me about the poor queen and her bedchamber, because it is not quite as nice as the king's. And I